Hey, Dr. Steve, nice to see you again.
Nice to see you.
So, I read an article recently that I thought would be a really good topic to talk about, and it was about teachers leaving their profession mainly due to the fact that kids, special needs, and I guess so-called normal kids, are misbehaving after a 2 year sort of vacation from school, and they don't know how to handle these kids, you know? So I thought that was, just it's a hot topic right now to talk about with how many teachers are leaving the school systems and how our school systems are already struggling. So I thought maybe you could give us some insight as to why that might be happening.
Well, a lot to discuss in that regard. Kids in general are not well suited for regimented classroom activity. Classes, the way our education system is structured really is not a match with child development. Movement is so key to learning and to development. As you know, the brain geographically matures, essentially inside out, bottom to top, back to front, and in layers. First sort of sensory motor, and then emotional factors, and finally cognition dominates. So let me just show a slide that would kind of walk us through that development. Let's see. I'm afraid you're going to have to give me sharing capacity here so that I can share a screen.
There you go.
Thank you. So if we look at, well, let me look at this slide here. Can you see those?
Yes.
Okay. Let me first show this kind of a general slide here. Here we see the sort of base of the brain, the middle part of the brain, where the motor tracts are, the motor nuclei. So we're sensory sensation comes in and movement responds. And that's the sensory motor cortex, you might say. It's kind of the base of the brain. And then the reticular system, where endocrine and emotional and autonomic factors then are built upon that. And so initially, environmental stimulus causes motion or movement. Then seeking satiation and emotional factors begin to influence how we move or why we move. And finally, our thinking apparatus of the neocortex, culminating in imagery with appropriate frontal lobe development and visual dominance emerging, then guides those lower brain centers of emotion and movement. So in the end, our choice of what we do is governed by what we envision. So what we think and what we do then cause our emotions and our physical actions. So we have control, volitional control, when we're mature enough to ideate or create imagery of the future. So we see the future consequence. We choose then our behavior, and from those choices come emotion. But during development, first our movements, our actions are governed by the environmental stimuli that present themselves. So shiny squirrels catch our attention, and we chase shiny squirrels in early development. And then we seek pleasure and satiation, and that's what guides our behavior. And finally, we master this uniquely human capacity to see through time and space and choose our behavior, which of course changes everything and separates the human being from all the other creatures. All the other creatures' behavior is governed by the seeking of pleasure and satiation, or even more fundamentally, whatever happens in the environment. I mean, with a laser pointer, I can control my cat by just simply moving the dot around. So the stimulus from the environment controls the cat's behavior. You, of course, won't chase the dot because your behavior is controlled by your view of the future that you constructed. So you're choosing your destiny, and the cat doesn't do that. The environmental stimulus overrides the cat's. The cat doesn't have the capacity to override the environmental stimulus. And that's really the story with attention deficit kids. They chase shiny squirrels or dots, if you will.
So, so once imagery becomes dominant, the based on the organization of the brain here in this picture, it goes from top down, or we change the order in which we process these things, rather than sensory to motor to emotion to choice or movement. It goes imagery to then motor
And emotion.
and yes, and emotion.
Yeah. So developmentally, it's sort of this bottom up thing.
Mm-hmm.
But then once we reach maturity, it's a top down. It's an efferent. Our life as mature human beings is an efferent process. That is, it comes from our consciousness and we distribute our consciousness out onto the environment.
Mm.
But during development, it's signal coming from the environment influencing my development.
This may be a silly analogy, but it kind of reminds me of like a flower growing. You know, it grows from the bottom up until, and then it grows out into the actual flower part. And then once the flower's there, things kind of happen in reverse. You know, the flower has its
Catches things and brings it to its base. Yeah.
Yep.
And that's really the story. We could use a tree maybe as the same analogy.
Mm-hmm.
It comes up, then the leaves catch the sunlight and bring it back to the base of the tree. Yeah, right. It's an interesting analogy there. Mm-hmm. But of course, imagery is the name of the game. I mean, that's reflectiveness versus impulsiveness. The cat is impulsively chasing the dot. And wherever the dot appears, the cat's behavior goes. So mm-hmm. that would be an impulsive behavior with the environment. And, you know, we might, I use another little story that kind of illustrates the point. My wife goes to the store and she parks in the parking lot. And before she gets out of the car, she's already accomplished her 12-item list. She's visualized all the stuff she's going to get. She knows exactly where it is in the store. She walks in the store, she makes the perfect moves of economy and gets the items in perfect sequence, pays, done, gone. Okay. She's perfectly efficient. Nothing gets in the way of her efficiency moves. The next day, she sends me to the store with a list of a dozen items that I don't quite know the brand or the size, the color of the container. I don't have it in my mind, any of that. Mm-hmm. I don't know where they are in the store either. So I get to the parking lot. I have nothing in my mind. As is a vacuum relative to the task. I walk into the store. I have no plan. I have not visualized a plan. So I start bumping around the environment, hoping to find something on this list. And I end up going back and then back and backtracking. And I encounter a kindly looking lady and ask her where I might find this or that. I'm distracted by kitchen gadgets or candy at the end caps of the aisles. The environment has a much greater impact on my behavior than if I knew exactly what I was doing. So the lack of visual plan leaves me susceptible to shiny squirrels or dots on the laser pointer, right? So my behavior is much more attention deficit for lack of a visualized plan.
Mm.
That's
Mhm.
the story of attention deficit. The child is not competent in constructing a visual plan and therefore has this difficulty. Well, the way we get to that visual dominance is by equating visual experience with tactile experience. That is, vision essentially becomes a virtual way of moving through the environment. And in order for that to happen, my eye movements have to be competent enough to create congruency between my visual input and my tactile experience. That is to say, I have to have coordinated binocular eye movement in order for those two sensations, my hand and my vision, to match. If I make an eye movement error, my vision doesn't match my touch, and I can't transition to visual dominance. Therefore, my visual attention does not develop in a cognitive sense, and I'm left in a vacuum. And that's the story of scattered attention, of attention deficits. It is that I don't see ahead of time what I'm going to do.
Mhm.
Therefore, I make bad choices. I don't really choose. When we ask the delinquent why he did that really stupid thing, you get the universal answer. I don't know. And that's a truthful answer. The
So
impulsive.
right, right. So how would you know if a child, if their eyes weren't matching what their hand found in the environment, and how slight of a deviation in or uh, discoordination in their eyes would there need to be for it to show up as an issue, I guess.
Well, it's unfortunately, even the tiniest of eye movement errors,
Mhm.
there's a one-to-one relationship between eye movement error and visual perceptive error.
Mm.
Every time the eyes move in a discoordinated fashion, the information that I receive through my visual system is a mismatch with the physical surround.
And we're not talking about clarity or acuity.
No,
Okay.
we're not talking about
Making sure.
clarity. We're talking about binocularity. The easiest way to explain this is go ahead and put your finger up right in line with my image on the computer and converge your eyes to your finger. So you're looking at your finger. With
Mhm.
your side vision, you can see that there's two of my image.
Right.
So, and likewise, if you look out at me on the computer screen, you'll notice that your finger splits into two.
Mhm.
So my point is, if you make an error in convergent eye movement or divergent, that is, you don't accurately coordinate the two, the perceptive result of that is that there are two objects out there.
Right.
And
Okay.
of course, your hand goes out and finds only one.
Mhm.
Now, there are four types of eye movement, the convergence and divergence being one of them. Focusing along the z-axis, we call that accommodation. That is focusing at near, focusing at far. And that's linked to convergence and divergence. And then there's pursuit eye movement, following a moving object or a circuitous path. And then what we call saccadic eye movement, the jump from one position to another. So the jump eye movements that we might make when we're hopping along a line of print, for example.
Okay.
Those four types of eye movements have to be looked at. We have to assess whether those are accurate or not, because if they're inaccurate, then a perceptive error will occur. For example, the child that loses their place a lot when they're reading. If you question the child, they'll often say, like if I say, why do you lose your place a lot? What causes you to lose your place? The child will say, well, the words move. Or they'll say something like the
Mhm.
words run together, or they're smeary, or, they'll use all kinds of terms. But essentially what they're saying is they perceive motion of the text. So my next question is, put your hand on the text. Can you feel it moving? And of
Mhm.
course, the answer is no, because the text obviously is not moving. what's moving is their eyes are making little mistakes in fixation or convergent divergent or focusing. And they perceive those motor errors, those muscle coordination errors, they lead to perception of motion where there is none. And when we have misperception of the physical world, we learn to pay less attention to visual and more to other sensations. Thus, we see the proclivity towards more physicality, the hyperactive child, or verbal precociousness or verbal impulsivity. And of course, these kids, I've heard 1,000 times, look at me when I talk to you. They don't point their eyes at your face when they're talking.
Mhm.
And of course, why would they not point their eyes at your face if you're conversing with them? Well, what if their visual system was giving them bad information? They could actually listen to you better if they were looking away from you. And that's the story. So eye movement accuracy, which is really the end game of a whole sequence of motor development in this base part of the brain, this sensory and motor development. And the motor development occurs gross motor to fine motor. That is let's look at another slide here. So balance and infantile or primitive reflexes give rise to gross motor and fine motor movements. And then finally, ocular motor movements. So big muscles first, then smaller muscles, and finally the finest muscles, the complicated ocular motor system, 12 muscles that control the position of the eyes. And they have to be really exquisitely accurate in order for sensory congruity to arise. And that's really what happens when a kid comes out of the terrible twos. Terrible twos, we say that terrible twos, we use that statement because the kid is marauding through space, touching everything. And we constantly have to protect them from touching the wrong stuff because they're maniacs. They're physical maniacs and they're impulsive. They touch everything. And of course, what happens is when their eye movements get mature enough to consistently get on the object of interest, their vision then is matchable to touch. And it's a very short period of time where they substitute visual touch for physical touch. And they come out of the terrible twos.
Because they find that it's more efficient.
It's just easier to cast your vision around and grab everything with your vision. And that's really our central visual field. So we see the big picture, our peripheral field, and then within that field of everything there, within the forest, we grab trees, we grab particles. That's our central visual field. We call this the magnocellular field, and this the parvocellular field. And it is the parvocellular field, the my grabbing of objects within the field, that is the start of a cascade of language expansion. I grab an object, then I name the object, and I use the object. So I see and identify the what pathway is this central field that I use for grabbing things. It becomes the replacement of my hand. And so I lock in my central field on these objects, then I name the objects, and we can trace the neurology of that right through the visual field. Let me show you some slides here. Here we have the eyes, and the central visual field goes through the midbrain and to the occipital lobe, and then carries forward to the frontal lobe. And let me show you another slide that shows that.
I think those people who have at least looked at the pathway of vision always assume that it goes straight from eyes to occipital lobe, but that's not just where the eyes lead.
No, the magnocellular field, the peripheral field, runs the central and peripheral vision runs through the optic nerve, and at the chiasm, the crossing point,
Mhm.
the nasal fibers cross over. So you can see these blue fibers cross to the other side of the brain. And at the lateral geniculate nucleus, let me see if I can, yeah, is the first synapse area. But just before the lateral geniculate nucleus, we see the peripheral fibers run up the superior and inferior colliculus. So these collicular pathways integrate the inner ear, the cochlear nucleus, and the inferior colliculus runs parallel with the superior colliculus here, just prior to the lateral geniculate nucleus. And that brings the peripheral visual field into the reticular system, the emotional part of the brain. We go back to our other slide here. So these pathways, the sensing pathways of vision at the superior colliculus run up through the endocrine, emotional, and autonomic to get to the frontal lobe. But the parvocellular, the grabbing, the particulate area, that runs through the back of the brain, the occipital, the primary visual cortex, the occipital lobe, and then emanates through two streams, we call the dorsal stream and the ventral stream, forward to the language area. So it is that central cone-mediated visual field that gives rise to language. And it's the rod and peripheral that governs our circadian rhythms, our autonomic balance, our emotional state, and our peripheral field, our imagery, if you will. The objects within the imagery are parvocellular. The imagery itself is magnocellular, and the emotional content is driven by the magnocellular field. And so when we make diagnosis about different types of attention and learning problems or abnormalities, we're really talking about the balance between the magnocellular and parvocellular fields.
Mhm.
And when there's a magnocellular neglect, or said differently, a parvocellular dominance, we end up with people that are very sequential and very logical, systematic, and have rather flat emotional faces, and prosody meaning the lilting emotional content of speech. So these people will be very flat of speech and flat affect in their face. Your classic Asperger's person. Elon Musk comes to mind. I mean, he's very analytical. That's why he's such a genius in the sequential processing. But he'll say things that are earth-shattering things, huge topics, and he'll say them in a rather flat way, like, well, yeah, this would probably destroy the world. Yeah, you just matter of fact, just stating the facts. And whereas the person that is more magnocellular would be your thespian, the person that is very dramatic, and they would be less sequential. And of course, we need both, and we need balance between the two. And most of the learning problems and attention problems and emotional problems are the result of an imbalance between these, and of course, a mismatch with environment. So that kind of circles us back to your original topic of, we're taking kids that are not yet visually dominant, and we're asking them to do things that require a good bit of visual sophistication. Essentially, we're putting them in the world of little marks on pages, right? Textual language. And of course, those things cannot be touched and emit no sound. And if you aren't visually dominant, you're a fish out of water, because when you try to deal with the visual nature of these things, everything that comes out of pencil is visual. Sound does not come out of pencil. None of the sensory experiences come out of pencils except vision. And likewise on the way in. Text cannot be touched and emits no sound. It is a visual experience. And if you don't bring vision to that task, you've got a problem. And of course, our whole teaching structure is mismatched. We teach reading via sound.
Mhm.
You should teach speech and listening via sound, but not reading. Reading is a visual event.
That's what
And
makes it so enjoyable.
well, it's the only enjoyable piece. The imagery that you create
Right.
from the clues that reside in those marks on a page. It is the imagery that is the payoff. And
Mhm.
you are the creator of the imagery.
Mhm.
How good are you at that task? Can you name that tune in fewer notes? That is to say, can you look at fewer squiggles on a page and create full and meaningful imagery? You're the speed reader if you can.
Mhm.
On the other hand, if you are converting all those little squiggles into sound elements and building up sound elements to be and enunciating language in your mind, you're a disabled reader.
Mhm.
So we've got a whole discussion on reading another day, but that's an important topic, a very important topic, but we'll devote another time for that. But this emotional thing, kids, we've got a mismatch going on in our K-12 schools, particularly the elementary schools, because our kids are achieving visual dominance later, primarily because of the influence of electronic media. Outdoor and lack of outdoor play. Outdoor unstructured play is how kids develop the motor skills in their big muscles and smaller muscles and ultimately eye muscles that lead to the ability to integrate vision and touch and then achieve visual dominance that then leads to the ability to construct imagery. The electronic media robs them of the outdoor play that's necessary for the motor development, and it makes the pictures for them,
Right.
robbing them of the cognitive practice of construction of imagery. The two things that are required for reading and writing and arithmetic are move the eyes with accuracy, see what those things should look like so that I can write them, and see what they mean from these symbols. If I'm not very acutely developed or intensely developed in my visual cognitive capacities, I can't do that.
Mhm.
And so introduction of heavy doses of television and electronic, cell phones and iPads and so forth, irrespective of the content that is delivered on them, is a really bad idea in young children because it robs them of the developmental experiences that lead to visual cognitive dominance. Let me use a term, mind sight, that is shorthand for visual cognitive dominance, the ability to see with my mind and construct imagery, which is then the basis of my ability to travel through time and space. I travel backwards in time and remember everything in the scene. I see what I did back then. And I make predictive imagery. I invent imagery of what I might want to do. It becomes the template that governs my action. And if I don't have that template, I chase dots like the cat, or I bumble around the grocery store because I don't have a vision of what I should be doing. So those are really important considerations. And then I go to school and it's a place of complex visual processing. And I'm delayed and I'm not very good at visual processing. I'm kind of a frustrated kid. And if I'm a kid that has grown up knowing nothing but the classroom, then I tolerate for the most part, right? But if you give me a couple years of freedom from that demand that's beyond me, and then you put me back in the cage, so to speak, I'm going to rebel. That's what's happening today. The kids have been out of school for a couple of years. School was mismatched before. And the kids were trying to tell us that it was mismatched because, of course, every teacher, the main job of a teacher, the most difficult job is classroom management. How do I get those kids to be engaged? Because they don't want to be engaged. Well, that should have been a clue, right? It's a red flag. We're doing
Meanwhile,
something.
we're giving teachers more and more students,
Yes.
making it even more difficult. And then there are more and more learning disabled.
Yeah, more and more students, and more of the students are mismatched because they're visually incompetent.
Right.
And the teacher's job is to teach them the symbolic representations of data, that is textual representations of information. And the kid doesn't even know how to interact, how to visually analyze the physical surround. How's he going to handle the abstract textual representations of the physical surround that he's still physically engaging with, as opposed to visually engaging with?
Right.
So,
if you can't put a shirt on, right, how are you how are we expecting them to do these other things?
right. And yet that's the demand on the teacher. And she's got 35 kids of all different levels of development. It's an impossible task.
Mhm.
And now a couple of years of freedom, and the kids are now shoehorned back into that classroom like bouncing BBs, and the teacher's just overwhelmed and finally throws in the towel. And that's what we're seeing. We're
Mhm.
seeing this massive exodus of teachers because they just can't handle it.
Mhm.
And it's really the basis of that is that the school environment is structurally incompatible with development. We
Right.
need to change the structure of schools. That's all there is to it. The
And
structure of schools is wrong. We should not be wedging kids or modifying kids to fit an obtuse system. The system must be malleable enough to fit the, the myriad of developmental circumstances that kids appear in, because no two kids are the same place in their development. We have to have an educational system that meets kids where they are developmentally. And I'm not talking about, first grade, second grade. That's a ridiculous summation. It's each kid at each learning situation. And we have to have a system of instruction that is malleable enough to meet those kids' requirements, and a system to help teachers understand when they're too complex and when they're not complex enough for the optimal learning to occur.
because
And
there is no purposeless behavior.
that's right. All behavior has a purpose. And so we really have to be diagnostic and prescriptive in our educational program.
Mhm.
And that's really what ICONIX is about. ICONIX is an educational approach that is diagnostic and prescriptive for the entire gamut of educational experience, including all of the stuff we want kids to learn: reading, writing, and arithmetic, and science, and math, and civics, and manners, and social skills, all of the things that we envision as the utopian school has to be included: music, arts, physical development. All of that stuff has to be encapsulated in the educational experience of the child. But how do we do that in a mass way? Well, you can't do it. I mean, the kids come in a bell-shaped curve like everything does. If you just hit the top of the bell-shaped curve, then the kids that are outliers, both slower in development and more advanced, get lost and get frustrated or bored and disengage. And so we have to have a system that is much more flexible and much more intelligent, much more prescriptive, and which requires diagnostics. And that's ICONIX. And if you have a mismatch, you pretty well guarantee emotional activation, emotional instability. And that's what's happening. And it's happening more acutely because kids have gotten a taste of freedom with the decentralized schools is really the story. And of course, I'm not even talking about, the political and social agenda that people are, that are the hot buttons of what's being taught. Parents should be entirely in control of that so that they get what they want about their own kids.
Well,
And
and parents should understand just the basics of what, like what we just talked about, so that they understand and they know and they can advocate these measures for their own child and even other children, you know.
that's right. It is incumbent upon us to help parents understand development
And
so that
teachers,
they can make
and
proper
teachers as
choices.
well.
And teachers, of course, yes. And
Teachers
and
in general.
so these are the factors that have to be taken into account. And these whole timetables of development, like the different areas of the brain develop at different times.
Mhm.
And we can schematicize this out in different slides. So you see the motor areas and the sensory areas, and then finally, we get up into the higher order neocortex. And there's all different ways of depicting these timetables. But the bottom line is we need to understand the timetables, respect the timetables, and develop our educational plan around the timetables after diagnosing where the child is in these hierarchical patterns of maturation.
Mhm.
And that's what ICONIX has done. And that's how we teach our teachers to become diagnosticians of thinking, and you might say development, as opposed to delivers of data. Because once kids master their development, the data is simple. For good students, school is easy and they hardly put any effort in and they get it all. It's the kids that are mismatched in development that have learned to learn obtusely that work so hard for so little gain.
Mhm.
So we really need to avoid the what we call deflected learning patterns. And when we detect kids that are learning in obtuse ways, we need to marshal our efforts to change how they learn as opposed to practicing their bad move, essentially. And that's this topic of deflected learning patterns, essentially learning disabilities. And that's a topic for another lecture as well.
Mhm.
That's a lengthy topic that we should cover at some point. So anyway, this kind of hot topic of teachers retiring because of bad behavior of kids re-entering the schools after a couple of year hiatus is all about at its fundamental core, the structural deficiencies of our current educational system, and the kids having experienced freedom from that structural constraint, now being wedged back into that constraint, they're not having it. And teachers don't know what to do and are overwhelmed and are quickly retiring. And that's what's really happening here. So it is a catastrophe for our culture in one respect, but it's also a catalyst for the appropriate change that we need to make.
Right.
So to save the culture, to save ourselves, we must adjust. And unfortunately, the bureaucratic sclerosis that surrounds our school system has sort of resisted the change that has been kind of obvious for a long time. I mean, there are 72 nations internationally that take international test scores of seventh graders in reading, math, and science. The United States scores about 50th every year for the last 50 years. Isn't that a brick in the face? I mean, come on. That's a red flag that we must be doing something wrong. We spend the most per pupil of any time and any place in the history of mankind. And barefoot Ethiopian kids are outperforming our kids. We must be making some wrong assumptions here. And indeed we are. Our schools are misstructured. And now we have a crisis that is, can't be swept under the rug. Something must be done. And of course, content and the political football that is another whole issue. And parental demand for control is the result. And those series of catalysts will propel us to education reform finally. And we need that. And
Our kids need it.
our kids need it. Our culture needs it. We're just making enormous strategic mistakes in education.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we can argue about how did that come to be. That is a whole nother discussion that is kind of off topic. But the point is, we have to build a system around the development as it really is. We now know much, much more about brain development. We need to build a system that respects that brain development, and we can do that. And that's what ICONIX has done. So,
Well, that was a lot. There was another topic that when we were looking at the brain and the hierarchies, you hit on the vestibular system, oculomotor system, and the emotional system. There are a bunch of interconnecting areas that are all essential, and I'd really like to talk about that another time too. So
yeah, the incoming signals from the cervical vertebrae are really important in visual perception as well. And that's a whole topic for discussion.
mhm.
And for the audience, they might, if you take your fingers like this and you put them back behind your head so that the middle finger is touching your base of your skull and your index finger touching the little muscles that run up the side of your spine, and you put them lightly there, and then just turn your eyes back and forth, and you'll feel those muscles, those neck muscles, moving in response to your eye movement as you move your eyes back and forth.
Mhm.
The integration of eye muscles and neck muscles are very powerful, and they influence visual perception. They change where we think things are. The importance of that is if you have a misaligned cervical vertebrae, that is as the chiropractic profession would say, subluxation, that influences visual perception, which then influences your ability to attend visually and to think visually, and therefore operate successfully in the school environment.
Mhm.
So, wow, there are so many things that need to be considered when we see a learning or attention or behavior problem in school. And we now know enough, we'll never know all of it, but we know more and more and more, and we have to adjust. We have to take advantage of that which we know in improving our educational system and looking for the causes of failure, behavioral failure, attentional behavior failure, and cognitive academic failure. We need to look for the underlying causes of these failures before we can successfully remediate them. Because let's face it, kids go into special ed, they never come out.
Mm.
The spread between their performance and their general ed peers only widens with time. Special ed is not curative. It is purely compensatory. We need to get at the underlying cause of the learning failure. And it's not that the kids have a condition. These kids do not have strange brains. They are, however, using their brains strangely. We have to figure out the cause of that and remove that cause. If we knew it ahead of time, we could prevent it. And indeed, we do know many, many things that could improve the educational system. We must bring neuroscience to education. That is what ICONIX does. And now's the time.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I think that's all the time we have for today, but thank you so much for all the information. And we have many more topics now to talk about.
Thank you for inviting me, and I appreciate uh, your efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.